We begin, of course, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country on which we meet, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, and paying our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'm Deborah Stone. I'm Editor-in-Chief of Plus 61J, and we're pleased to be sponsoring this session. If you don't know us, Plus 61J Media, Plus 61, the calling code for Australia, of course, J for Jewish. We're the media organisation online that's committed to social justice in Australia, Israel, and the Jewish world. We're here today to host a session on reporting in times of crisis. As someone who's been in journalism for more than 30 years, I think it's always a time of crisis when you're reporting, but certainly the past couple of years have been particularly strong in raising the bar on what constitutes a difficult time. And we have with us today a very eminent panel. I must say I've done a fair bit of moderating over the years and I'm not usually daunted by the people whom I sit beside, but today I am somewhat. It being the time of COVID, we have a combination of virtual and live participants. On the screen we have Professor Peter Doherty, Nobel Prize-winning immunologist, one of Australia's most prestigious and eminent scientists. And we have Professor Margaret Simons, one of Australia's most eminent journalists and journalism academics, and a personal professional hero of mine. To my left, your right, we have Dr. Norman Swan, a name I'm sure is familiar to just about all of you as the ABC health reporter, physician journalist, and the guide for most of us through COVID over these past couple of years. And to my right, we have Zoya Sheftalovich, whom some of you may not know. She's a contributing editor for Politico. She's Ukrainian-born, and over the past several months, she's become an interpreter of the Ukraine for many people at a time when we've all suddenly realised how much more we need to understand about that part of the world. The format today is that I'll be putting questions to the panellists. We'll be having conversation, discussion between the panel. At the end, there will be a short period of time for you to ask questions. I'm assuming there's a roving mic somewhere that someone will bring to you. I hope. Let's start off by talking about those past couple of years in COVID and what it's taught us about the media. When much of the world shut down during COVID, nurses and supermarket workers were allowed to get out of isolation because, of course, health and food care and food is essential. But journalists were also allowed exemptions from isolation because information is just as important. To what extent did the media provide an essential service in reporting the rise and management of COVID-19? Margaret, can we put that question to you first?
Yes, well, it's an enormous question, perhaps bigger than you intend, because, of course, if we talk about the media, we're talking about everything from Sky News After Dark to Coronacast and everything in between. I think there was some excellent reporting, and Coronacast, as I've indicated, is at one end of the spectrum. It was certainly my personal guide. And there was other excellent reporting as well, but of course at the other end of the spectrum we had lies and misinformation being put out by supposedly mainstream media. And in the middle we had a lot of mediocre stuff, basically. I think the reporting of the politics of the pandemic, which is really inseparable from the public health, I think public health is innately political in a sense. It's about how communities organise themselves and how they prioritise things. But those awful press conferences with Dan Andrews in which the media, I coined a term, performative watchdoggery, in which they were sort of performing being watchdogs and really forgetting why journalists actually do that. I mean, we do that at our best, not to tear government down, but to make it better. And of course, millions of people were watching those press conferences, and what they most wanted was information. What's happening? Why is it happening? When's it going to stop? Those sorts of things, and the journalists were all, who hired the security guards and so on, which now seems like the height of irrelevance. And we've seen the same sad tendencies, I think, in the reporting of the recent federal election campaign. I really think journalists need to get back to understanding why we do those things. But there was also an awful lot, and the University of Canberra has done some research into this. The vast majority of media content was actually straight information. How to get vaccinated, where to get vaccinated, what the numbers are. That actually was the majority of media content. And while that might not be particularly stunning or Walkley Award winning, it was definitely useful. So, full spectrum.
How did it feel from where you sit, Peter?
Well, as a consumer of media, I'm ABC, what were the Fairfax papers, Guardian Australia, and The Conversation, along with the New York Times and the Washington Post, are my main media sources. But as someone who's of interest to media, as I was through this, I found the people that I talked to across the spectrum, from left to right, and that included Sky News and Saturday Paper and so forth, were uniformly decent to talk to and respectful. I'm very careful in my broadcast media interactions to try as far as possible to stick to unedited content, because I don't trust some media outfits after an experience with 60 Minutes some years ago, for instance. So unedited content is fine. And from what I saw of written content, and that's often in papers that I don't buy or read, but people sent me articles, it was fine. So my experience of media was good, but I wasn't putting myself out there. I made it very clear I would not comment on public health policy because of the danger of getting across some of the information that was coming from our epidemiologists and some of our own people who are involved in public health. I talked about vaccines, I talked about the virus and about the disease and how it works, and that was my field, if you want. And I left the rest of it to others. And of course, Norman was wonderful in all this.
Were you put under pressure by journalists to comment on aspects of public health that you felt you weren't qualified to comment on?
I just told them no. I'd sometimes make a fairly general comment, and sometimes I am on Twitter, and if you're on Twitter, you always do some foolish things at times. I did have a little commentary on Twitter, but very little. It's not my field. I don't know it, and I don't think I have any real expertise in it. On Twitter, I comment on all sorts of things where I have absolutely no expertise, including economics. Now, I wonder if there are many economists who have much expertise.
Norman.
You'd have to say Peter's shy and retiring on Twitter. Very.
Norman, your leadership in reporting COVID has been widely acknowledged, including by Gold Walkley. Did it feel different reporting COVID from the other journalism you've done for many years as a health reporter?
Well, I've always been interested in pandemics, and I did a 4-part series for Channel 4, 1990. But I never thought I'd live through one, really. When we had the 2009 flu pandemic, which was a small pandemic, luckily, but it was an eerie kind of out-of-body experience actually seeing this unfold. Now, the interesting thing here is, I think that, so there's lots of different streams of thought running through all this, but no textbook of public health will have to be rewritten as a result of COVID-19. It behaved the way pandemics have behaved for hundreds, if not thousands of years. If you read Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, it reads like COVID-19 before we had vaccines and treatments and so on. Social distancing, isolation, the poor being locked in their homes or nailed in their homes, borders being closed. That's what we reverted to then, and it was eerie to actually experience it. Now, the interesting undercurrent here is that what I've done for most of my career is report on science. Now, the science is the science. You can debate around the edges, but in a pandemic, there's probably not a lot of debate around the edges. The science is the science. So epidemiologists in Melbourne are just as good as the epidemiologists in Sydney or Brisbane or Perth. And yet you saw variation, particularly at a federal level, which I can come back to. And if you saw variation, you knew it was political, because you knew they had to be getting the same advice because they had good epidemiologists advising him, you knew what they were being told, and yet you were seeing variation. So the problem was then at reporting that inevitably, this comes to Margaret's point, is that you got into political reporting as well. Now, the states were much more even and similar to each other than the federal government. And the federal government was far more political about this than the states were, no matter what you might think in Victoria with massive lockdowns. And part of the reason was actually scientific. They had terrible scientific advice. They had a committee which were really nice people, clever people, very good for stopping the spread of methicillin-resistant golden staph in hospitals or influenza, but they didn't know about pandemics, and they didn't know about how respiratory viruses spread. And they were working on out-of-date data. So this stuff about surfaces, 1.5 meters, yes, somebody coughs in your face with COVID, you'll catch it. But mostly you're catching it by breathing in somebody else's air. Well-established science, which they were ignoring. And people like me were called miasmatists, going back to the Middle Ages, where they didn't know what caused plague, so they thought it was coming from the ground. It's actually a compliment being called a miasmatist, because the aerosol is a bit like a miasma, which you then breathe in. So what you found was, and it comes back to what Margaret was alluding to, the variation in the media, is that the media split kind of predictably ideologically, and you had the libertarians. So if you look around the world, where you had libertarians in power, like in Britain, where we're not going to get involved in this, we're going to let it rip, we're going to get a herd immunity. 45,000 people died in Britain, and they achieved 6% herd immunity. And so ideology came in and intervened with science. And so essentially, the Prime Minister's office ran a campaign via News Limited. And one comment I made was that, because talking about lockdown early on, was I said that within 8 weeks, I'll be pilloried by News Limited, and it only took 6 weeks. Because when public health works, nothing happens. You don't notice when public health works. And the ideologues got onto it. It was a very interesting time, which isn't over. I mean, if you waste your time by reading News Limited, then you'll see that the attacks continue.
So did you feel that you spent far too much time reporting politics rather than reporting health?
No, but you had to take account of that and realize what the differences were. And you got no friends. And I take Peter's point, which is that the epidemiologists and the public health people were trying to communicate very important public health messages. And then you had but there were times, and it's worth a conversation, when you had conflict. The most difficult time for me was, so there are lots of difficult moments, but the most difficult and stressful time for me ethically was when they started reporting the clotting problem with the AstraZeneca vaccine. And what's the important element here, at least in terms of media organizations, you can understand why Rupert Murdoch hates the ABC. He spent generations building up an empire, but when anything happens in the country moves to the ABC, because that's where they're trusted. Now, what was happening was you had this clotting problem in countries with really good researchers, really good immunologists, and they were getting to the bottom of it. And yet our so-called experts were saying, oh, this is non-existent, it's not a real problem, there's no biological plausibility, when there was biological plausibility. So if this is wartime, do you say, well, I'll go with the propaganda, or do you report it as it is? And I reported it as it is. And famously got one text from a Liberal MP who now no longer has that person's seat in this city, saying, do you know that you're single-handedly responsible for vaccine hesitancy in Australia? And that was the hardest moment, I think.
It's terrible.
Margaret, you referred to the fact that during the pandemic, particularly I think in Victoria, we saw a great deal of performative journalism. We had these daily media conferences for a very long time, and it enabled the public to see the process of journalism in a way which I don't think they had before, not perhaps over an extended period. Do you think that led to a better understanding of what journalists do?
Well, I hope not, because most people, of course, hated it, and I was sitting at home watching it as well as doing a bit of my own journalism, and I could see why. I mean, I think there was some just terrible behaviour at those news conferences, mainly, but not exclusively, from News Corporation journalists, and I agree with what Norman has said in his assessment of that, of their performance. But at the same time, having gone to plenty of political news conferences myself over my career, you know, they're never pretty. I mean, you're always often trying to get politicians to answer questions who, you know, don't intend to answer any questions, and that can involve a fair bit of aggression. You often conclude afterwards, well, that was a bit of a silly question I asked, wasn't it? And you'll sort of triangulate and take that into account when you go back to the newsroom to write it up. But what was happening here is because so many people were watching it and so intently, the news conference became the journalism. Far more people, you know, tuned into those news conferences than ever read any of the produced journalism, in which a lot of those questions, the stupider questions, probably would never make it to air or into an article, because the journalist would have concluded that they were unproductive questions. But most people wouldn't read the article. The news conference was the journalism. And so I think it did our profession a lot of harm. But I also think, and this disturbs me as a journalism educator, we have seen the same sort of pointless aggression in some of the federal campaign coverage recently. And again, it's not all journalists, but unfortunately the ones who do it are the ones you hear most from, of course, if you're just watching the media conference. You know, and journalism is meant to be part of improving governance, including by holding to account and scrutinising. You know, you don't do it to tear down government just because perhaps you can. The other thing, I'd just like to pick up on something Norman said. One of the challenges, I think, for journalists, particularly journalists who've got no speciality in this field, was that there were points where the experts disagreed. Not so much on the science, as Norman is saying, but on the appropriate social response. You know, when do we lift restrictions? When, you know, what sort of quarantine arrangements do we have? Is this the year in which the pandemic is over, according to Nick Coatsworth, for example? Now, somebody in Norman's position knows who all these people are, knows who the respected experts are, knows if somebody's coming probably from an ideological or a political base. But most journalists, including myself, don't know that or didn't know it at the outset. And I think that as time went by, the media outlets divided among the experts along ideological lines, I agree. But I think at the beginning, none of us realised that the experts would actually disagree. So you'd go and interview one expert and get a totally different take on what the government should be doing from the next one. And that, for journalists who have no pre-existing expertise or understanding of the experts, that was very confusing and led to some poor reporting, for which the journalists are partly responsible, but not entirely.
Is that an indication that we need to think again about the way we train journalists, that we need more Normans, journalists who are trained in science and medicine, not just people who come up through the ranks and get sent to whatever round they need someone for today?
We certainly need more Normans. You know, we'd like cloning science to advance at some speed, Norman, so we can have more of you. But, you know, speaking from the great height of 40 years in journalism, it's easy for me to criticise. I have learned over a lifetime to triangulate, to try and assess the credibility of sources, to back check with other sources whether this source is reliable and all that sort of thing. Those are not skills that people are born with. And of course, over the course of that 40 years, we have seen the business model that supports most journalism just about collapse. There are simply many fewer journalists now than there used to be. One of the areas that has been relatively safeguarded is political journalism. And one of the reasons, not necessarily the main reason, but one of the reasons the pandemic was politicised is because it was being reported by political journalists rather than science or health journalists, because there simply are very, very few of them left. So, you know, if you're a political journalist, you know, if you've only got a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? It all looks like a political problem rather than a health or a scientific problem. So it's part of, and we see the reduction of quality in journalism all over, and it's not entirely because of the collapse of the business model, but that is the underlying problem that affects everything else. Fewer journalists, less time to do their journalism, writing to a constant deadline rather than, as I had the luxury of doing 40 years ago, one deadline a day, having to produce social media content, video content, audio content, as well as text or whatever, and doing it constantly. That is a big problem, and it leads to superficial journalism, and I think it's probably one of the reasons why you go for this sort of gotcha type story, rather than thinking, well, what is the constructive role that I can do here? What is the government doing right, doing wrong in a more sort of constructive and considered way, rather than just, let's put him under pressure because we can, or we think we can.
Zoya, this might be a good place to bring you in, because the way in which the war in Ukraine has been reported is very much affected by the kind of journalism we have now, the speed at which news is reported and the involvement of social media platforms. What can you tell us about the accuracy of what we're hearing from the Ukraine and the way in which we're perceiving the war there?
I think there's a real problem in reporting of the Ukrainian war, or really the Russian war on Ukraine, and that problem stems from the fact that there are very few people who have expertise of that region. And it is a very specific region, it has very specific politics. It's not like Western world reporting where you can say such and such politician said this, someone responded like that. The problem is that if you've got a lot of reporters who've never reported on Russia or Ukraine before, when you see some of the statements that come from the Kremlin, the tendency is to report them as Putin said this. And we saw that even so when the war was declared, when Putin declared the war, the way that he declared it was by saying that he was launching a special military operation to denazify and demilitarize eastern Ukraine. And I was watching that press conference live. It was mid-afternoon in Australia. And instantly when I saw that press conference and listened to what he said, because I speak Russian and understand Russian, I understood that that was a declaration of war against Ukraine. I then wrote that story. We published that story within probably 15 or 20 minutes from that press conference. I then looked around and I saw that the vast majority of stories that were published at that time mimicked Putin's language and called it a special military operation in eastern Ukraine. And so if you were reading all of those articles, you would think that, I mean, it's not clear what a special military operation is. You would think that the troops were only in eastern Ukraine. You probably wouldn't know what eastern Ukraine was. You wouldn't know what Putin was trying to achieve, and it would be very, very difficult to understand what was actually happening. My story called the war a war, and having listened to the entirety of the press conference in Russian, I was able to ascertain that this was by no means actually just limited to the east of the country, but that Putin's troops were moving on Kiev. And there was a moment where my boss and I had a phone call where he had a bit of a wobbly moment and he said, Zoya, have we called it wrong? Is it a war? And I said, it's absolutely a war. This is not, we can't use this term special military operation. And about half an hour, the Financial Times in the UK, their big headline was special military operation. And so I think that is the danger. When people don't speak the language, when people don't understand what that language actually means, when you don't have that expertise, you mimic the Putin's propaganda lines by sheer virtue of the fact that that's how journalists are taught to report. You listen to a press conference, you report on what is said. And so that, I think, has been the challenge, my challenge, and I think the reason why I have been able to, I mean, most of you may not have heard of me. People heard of me and found out about me as a Ukrainian journalist in Australia through Twitter, because I spent my time listening to press conferences, listening to Putin, listening to Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, listening to the Ukrainian politicians in their own language and explaining what they meant. So there was what they said, which was what most journalists were reporting, and I was trying to report on what they meant. And that's been my mission through this war, to decipher some of that mealy-mouthed language that comes out of the Kremlin. And if I'm being frank, I mean, the statements that Vladimir Zelensky makes and that the Ukrainians make are also needing interpretation. And also frequently they will make announcements that are less fact and more wishful thinking. And so it's actually taking that approach to both sides of this, because obviously there is one country that is the aggressor, that has declared war. that I think is very clearly run by an autocrat and a dictator. But you do actually have to cut through the noise on both sides, because there is, the fog of war is an old phrase. It's true. There is a fog of war, and it's being able to tell people what's actually happening on the ground, what it means when someone says phrases that don't mean anything to us. And I think that's been my mission, and it's been a difficult one. And it does mean that I'm frequently behind. So I'm not always first out of the gates when I'm doing my reporting, because I need to do more than just report on what is being said. I need to sort of look into it, figure out what's happening. You do lose some of that premium in not being first, because we do live in this kind of media 24-hour cycle where you have to be first. There's this pressure for scoops, pressure to have the first headline, pressure to have the first on social media, be the first one to tweet something. I've felt that pressure my whole career. I started my career in this kind of environment, and I am used to trying to be first. But I've now realized that there is a lot to be said, and there are a lot of readers out there who are they're comfortable waiting an hour or two if what you can give them at the end of that is a framework around which they can understand something that is very, very foreign to an Australian audience or to an American audience.
That 24-hour news cycle is, I think, a problem that any of us who were in journalism before it happened have become very aware is creating problems for the quality of information that we are getting. Do any of you see a way we address that? Is there a way of making people understand that speed is not always a good thing, and stepping back from the sort of he said, she said journalism to which Zoya has referred, to a point at which analysis and informed journalism is more valued?
Well, can I have a go at that one? I'm actually a little bit optimistic about that, because I think it's already happening to some extent. Even the best managements in the world would have struggled with the speed of change that media has been through, and we haven't had the best management in the world, not by a long shot. And they tried a whole load of things which were basically wrong. So we had the time when everybody thought all anybody wanted was opinion. And then there was clickbait. Now, for most serious journalistic media these days, clickbait doesn't work, because people might click on it, but they won't pay for it. And all the advertising revenue virtually has now disappeared to Google and Facebook. So what's the point of getting somebody to click on a story if you're not going to earn any advertising revenue from the fact that they've got their eyeballs on a particular screen? And so now it's all about getting people to pay subscriptions. Now, only about 13% of adult Australians pay a subscription for a news service. Of course, the ABC is free at the point of use, and so that probably affects that figure. It's lower than internationally. Internationally, it's about 17%. And so the game for serious journalistic media is all about getting people to pay subscriptions. Everybody's trying to figure out what people will pay for. People will click on clickbait and they will read opinion, certainly, but they won't pay for it. And what they are paying for, the evidence seems to suggest, is exactly what you're suggesting we need more of: more analysis, more depth, more quality, and less concern about being first. I mean, you don't want to be last either, but it's better to be correct than to be first. So I think as a long-term trend, that is actually quite encouraging. But against that optimism is that fact that only 13% of people are paying a subscription, and it's not growing fast. It's growing very, very slowly, if at all, at a time, and it was growing slowly even when the population was growing faster than it is now. So, mainstream media, most serious journalistic media, is increasingly becoming a bit of an elite game. And that is a real worry. But I think we will see more analysis, because I think that is the new business model, to actually pay a subscription because it gives you access to something which you can't get any other way. And, where would we be without the ABC? The ABC is one of the big differences between Australia and the USA, and one of the things which will make our politics different, I think, because it is free at the point of use. It's not free, of course, we pay for it through our taxes, but free to the user. Very trusted, far and away the most trusted media outlet in Australia by a country mile. and pretty much all pervasive. Most Australians access some ABC content over the course of a normal week. And that makes a huge difference, I think, to just about everything. So it's a mistake to think we're inevitably going to go down the Trumpian path, I think. And one of the reasons that we won't is because of the ABC. There are others as well. We have different cultures, but the ABC is a big part of that.
So what you've got, I mean, where if you go to the extreme, which is the United States, so you've got the long tail, which is people read Politico, the Axios, New York Times, Washington Post, and so on. So there's a long tail, reasonable subscriptions. New York Times, huge. Washington Post, huge. Politico does very well. But you have this divide, which is complicated by social media, citizen journalism, the Steve Bannons of this world, and you've got a community which is divided, and they only, some people will consume the media that Peter just described, and some people will never go near those, and they're only going to get it from Fox or the social media, and you get this political divide in the country, and you've got fragmentation in the market, particularly the electronic media. So in the United States, there is no television program anymore, not Meet the Press or 60 Minutes or anything. There is no single television program which will change the public debate, whereas we do. We've got Four Corners, 7:30, and they still can change the debate in the country. And so public broadcasting is a civilizing influence on this, but you've got, the problem is the drift in the market towards simplistic jingoism, in a sense. I'm being stretching to find the words, but you know what I mean, which is that you've got well-considered analytical journalism on one side, and you've got some of the best in the world in the United States, but vast millions of Americans never go near it.
Yeah.
Is it possible to have well-considered analytical journalism which is distributed through social media?
Yes. Sorry, Peter's trying to say something, but I'll just hop in there, because one of the things which I sort of worries me most is people sort of saying, social media is a single thing, whereas in fact it's a distribution channel. It's it can be used for many things, for good and ill, but more to the point, it's not going away. And if journalists don't deal with it and get good at dealing with it and using it, then we leave it to the bad actors. So, whether we love social media or hate it, I think personally, it's a dereliction of journalistic duty to retreat from it. We've got to actually get better at it. But Peter's been trying to say something for a while, so I'll shut up now.
Yeah, with respect to the United States, I lived there a long time, and one of the best radio programs you can tune into is the National Public Radio, All Things Considered, which is consistent and thoughtful and free to air. But people don't go to it. People want, it seems, entertainment. And part of that entertainment is being outraged about this or that, which I always find it sends me into despair, quite frankly. And the lack of analytical thinking, apart from any understanding of science in the broader community, is an issue. So people who do indulge in analytical thinking are now described as elites. So I think of the elites as the people who have all the money and all the power. But they're not the elites. They're using populism to reinforce their position. And that's part of the problem we have with the Murdoch media, for example. So one of the better things I've done since coming back to Australia was to help Andrew Jasp get the conversation going. That's basically written by academics, then edited by journalists. And that started in Melbourne. It's worldwide. If you don't look at it, sign up and you'll get content to your email inbox every day. And it's been an enormous success. But what percentage of the population does that ever reach? That's this problem of getting beyond what I think is at maximum 20% of the population who will engage with serious content.
But I will say that when it comes to Ukraine, actually, to the question of whether you can get serious analysis on social media, it is wholeheartedly yes. Some of the best reporting on Ukraine has come out on Twitter. That is the space where I operate largely. A lot of my content is exclusively for Twitter. I will watch and listen President Zelensky's nightly addresses and analyse them in Twitter threads, some of the most interesting content coming out about the war in Ukraine is coming from experts in, for instance, military strategy, who don't write for any publication, who, for instance, might be academics or might be former military generals or experts, who will write extremely analytical, fascinating Twitter threads looking at what's happening on the ground. There have been some really interesting ones about the mud season and the impact of the mud season on the Russian aggression, and how the various tanks and machinery have gotten bogged down in the mud, written by American army mechanics sitting in Virginia, who are able to look at these photos that are posted on social media, on TikTok, of bogged down Russian military equipment and explain why it gets bogged down. And the beauty of that is that then someone like me can come in and analyse. So they'll give the technical reasoning for what's happening on the ground and why that military advance has slowed to such an extent, or did slow to such an extent in March. And then someone like me can come through and say, look, this is indicative of the level of corruption in Russia. This is why we're seeing these military vehicles bogged down. So they're bogged down because they haven't been maintained. They haven't been maintained because of the level of corruption in the country that's pervasive from the bottom to the top. And so that kind of building upon building upon building block on Twitter is something that doesn't happen in a newspaper article or on a TV report, because you just would never even know that there's some guy sitting in his apartment in somewhere in the US or somewhere in Australia or somewhere in wherever, who's able to look at these photos, and then someone else can come on top of that. So I think there is a lot to be said for this kind of reporting on social media, which is happening on Ukraine beautifully.
But one of the interesting things that happens is that exactly those people you're talking about get picked up by producers. So producers are following the Twitter threads, and you'll hear them on air. They started on Twitter, they're looking for new talent. They find them on Twitter, perhaps through your stuff, Zoya, or just they start following people. And some of the people you're starting to hear on air, that's where they started.
Yeah. And I one of my main pieces of pandemic reporting was the public housing lockdown in Melbourne, when 5 public housing towers were completely locked down with absolutely no notice whatsoever. And it just happens to be my neighbours. If I look out of the window to my left here, I can see those towers. And I was reporting for The Guardian in a more or less conventional way, but also running a constant Twitter thread, which I originally intended to be for the residents, my neighbours, about, what was happening, and because initially they had no food, for example, so talking about what was happening with that. But it got a very wide audience, nationwide. But included in that were Department of Health bureaucrats who were actually doing their best to solve the problems, and were following my Twitter thread and also DMing me in Twitter to tell me information which I was then able to tell others. So it became, a really, I think, quite powerful reporting platform. So, it's a technology, it's a platform. There's obviously, terrible use of it. Misinformation is one of the great evils of our time. But that's not social media. That's the way people are using it. And journalists have to be the honest brokers here. It drives me to despair to see journalists retreating from it, because I think that's a really bad move. Having said that, I do know that some journalists, particularly female journalists, get a terrible time, which is quite unjustified. But I still say we need to get better at dealing with it, and organisations need to get better at supporting journalists in dealing with it.
It has always been a challenge for journalists to get the voices of those affected by an issue, and social media certainly makes it easier to do that. In that sense, it makes media much more democratic. But the other side of this is what you've all referred to, really, which is that there is a section of the media that is working really well, really professionally, doing amazing analysis, and a very large number of people ignore it and go on Sky News or read the Murdoch papers. What can we do, if anything, to reach everybody else?
Well, one point of correction, very few people watch Sky News. I've done some research on this, and the audiences are tiny. And when you confront News Corp with this, they then say, oh yes, but we've got great reach on social media. Now, I won't go into all the metrics, but I've looked at that, and that's not true either. most of the content that Sky News Australia produces that does well on YouTube is actually about politics in the USA. We've become a production studio for the QAnon crowd in the USA. The Australian political content on Sky News hardly reaches anyone at all. So Sky News is not watched or read by many people, and the News Corporation newspapers are mainly read by an ageing and dwindling population of people who are already fixed in their views. So the idea that Murdoch is turning votes, well, the recent election has told us that that's not true, but there's actually been a string of state and federal elections over the last 15 years where Murdoch has campaigned for a particular outcome with no discernible effect whatsoever. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, and I'm not saying it's not influential, and certainly it's spread misinformation in some places, but it doesn't have the sort of influence that many politicians and journalists ascribe to it. And I think we've really got to sort of grow up a little bit about that and start charting our own path rather than constantly being reactive to the Murdoch media, because it's actually not as influential on the average person as we tend to fear.
Yeah, I think the demographics are totally against that extreme libertarian type of journalism. And the other thing about the Murdoch media, it's not necessarily media anymore. It's a publicity arm for a big business empire, and for the people who will advertise in them. But what's happening here and in the United States is that the demographics with regard to ethnic populations, we saw that play very big in our election, I think, with the Chinese population feeling marginalised and insulted and not respected. I think the Indian population was also earlier on insulted and not respected by the government, so that's a big factor. But again, it's the young people coming on. They're not reading print newspapers. I know, we talk to people of our generation in Queensland, they all read the Brisbane Courier Mail. It's a remarkably consistent newspaper. It was absolutely toxic and dreadful when I grew up there, and it hasn't changed one little bit.
And the other thing that I would say is, in terms of how we reach more people, it's money. I think the problem for journalism, largely, as I have seen it and in the newsrooms that I have worked in, is that for the first 10 years of my career, every day I would come into the newsroom and the question would be, how do we do more with less? Who is getting fired? Who is being made redundant? How many hits did you get because that's not enough and you've got to pull up your bootstraps? And that was the first 10 years of my career. And I didn't realise just how incredible it was to work in a place where that was not an issue until I started working for Politico, which was a new media organisation with a different business model. And that business model is essentially writing for the elites, if we're going to be honest. I mean, we don't dumb down our content. We're targeting politicians, we're targeting lobbyists and policymakers. And as a result, we can free ourselves of the need to really appeal to the general masses. We charge a lot of money for our subscription products, and that funds our free reporting, and that is why I do what I do. And being in a newsroom where the question was, how do we get enough journalists, where we need more, we've got more things, where can we hire more people, who are the people we can hire? That was revolutionary to me. I imagine that's probably what journalists felt like in the golden age of reporting when there were, rivers of classified gold. But to me, it was such a revelation to be somewhere where I was told, just get the story right. If you need to go if you can't do this report from behind your desk, what are you doing behind your desk? Go and report from on the ground. If you want to fly wherever you need to fly, go and do it, do the reporting. And that is by sheer virtue of the fact that the subscription model that Politico has funds that sort of journalism. And I think we do need to figure out as a media industry how we stop going for those low common denominator subscriptions or advertising dollars which cost nothing and which have you constantly anxious about how many clicks you get, and move towards something like the ABC model. I mean, the reason why the ABC is so great is because they don't have that severe pressure in the newsroom. And I've been in newsrooms where young reporters will do whatever it takes for clicks because there will be tallies. I mean, there are tallies. You look at the wall and there's a chart beat kind of graph which tells you which stories are getting clicked on and which stories aren't. And if you're at the bottom of that list, consistently, you'd better believe you are scared and you start doing things that maybe you otherwise mightn't do in order to get back toward that top of that tally. And that's a scary place to be.
And so the ABC has flirted in that area as well, so it's not been free of that temptation for clickbait. I mean, I think the core, when you say what can we do, there essentially is market failure in the media. You know, the market fails in education, the market fails in health, and the market fails in the media. And the United States hasn't recognized it. Luckily, it's got the size of population where something like Politico or the New York Times, Washington Post, others can survive because there's enough people there paying subscriptions at that higher end. But essentially, in most parts of the world, unless you've got a public sector broadcaster, the market is not going to go your way in terms of what you're looking for, which is analysis, careful thought, and so on. Now, the very fact that you've got a public sector broadcaster changes the nature of the media beyond it, because you create market pressure. That's why it's always been a curiosity to me that federal governments and sometimes Labour governments have been very opposed to the ABC, when in fact the ABC forces a different kind of dynamic in the market because it becomes a competitor. So Murdoch would love us to dismantle our online, which is massive, our online presence, so that he can get in. But the fact that we have that online presence means it has to have changed. I haven't seen, Margaret's done some analysis on this, but it has to change the market. The BBC has to change the market. Deutsche Welle has to change the market. So the market does not operate. So if you leave it to the market, you get what you get.
So why are politicians so resistant to the ABC? Is it just that it's expensive?
No, because we're the fourth estate and we hold them to account, as does Fairfax. To be fair, there are good journalists within News Limited. They're just not necessarily able to do the work that they want to do. Yep. So when you hold people to account, you're not necessarily liked. Bob Hawke got in and cut our budget by 10%. Yes. One of his first acts.
And it's because if you're working at the ABC and you have less of that commercial pressure as an individual journalist, you can actually get to the bottom of things much more so than if you've got these intense deadlines and if you have to turn things around and if there's someone hanging over your back saying, come on, just file. And so you're less likely to dig a bit deeper into, you have fewer people. I mean, the ABC newsrooms are better resourced, better equipped. If you look at what's happened to what was formerly known as Fairfax newsrooms, the Age newsroom here, the Sydney Morning Herald newsroom, they've been decimated over the last few decades. Of course, that has hit the ABC as well. That's not to say that they've been completely inoculated from that kind of market pressure, but there are just more people there doing that really important work. Whereas if you're cutting, essentially what has happened in the Sydney Morning Herald and in the Age is that as the older, more expensive people retire or are pushed out, more and more young, cheap people are hired. But the moment they get to a particular point in their career, they become too expensive or they themselves no longer want to deal with it.
So just to give you, before we start going overboard about how wonderful the ABC is, exactly that dynamic happens at the ABC. The newsroom is now run by children. You'd be shocked. Yeah. I mean, they are children. Once you get beyond a certain level, you're considered too expensive and you're edged out the door. And that is major. Now, you might have noticed the Ukrainian coverage first up. We were sending children into Ukraine when we've got experienced war correspondents like Mark Willisey, like Sally Sarah, even Tony Jones, who's sort of semi-retired there, could have gone in. We weren't sent in, by and large. It took them a while to get them in. And even the people that are there now, they've been learning on the job because too expensive.
And I would add to that, something I've noticed recently is that there are a lot of excellent particularly former Fairfax writers who are working in communications, writing media releases which are better written than the articles and are picked up wholeheartedly by children straight out of media courses who are not given the time to question what they're receiving.
Yeah, I've also had the experience of being interviewed by BBC in their studios, and I have the impression that the ABC is vastly under-resourced when you compare it with the BBC.
It is. No doubt about that.
So,
and also, we need to restore Radio Australia, particularly out into the Pacific region. That was the absolutely stupidest thing that ever was done. I don't know what happened there.
well, I'll tell you what
following
happened.
it,
John Howard sold the transmitters to a Christian broadcasting organisation.
Yeah, well, John Howard is, a great regressive politician of our era, really set us on the course we were on until this year.
Before I ask any more, I feel like I should give the audience a bit of a chance for questions here. We do have a roving mic. If you'd like to ask a question, please let us know. There's one down here.
Thank you. Thank you for the interesting panel discussion. Just one thing that has been clear to me, that we assume that scientists are pure and give correct information. That's what I grew up on. Great respect for scientists. Two things have come to my mind. One is Fauci and his the science that he was spreading, and he was spreading because he has a vested interest, which was disclosed after he did give his reports. And then what Norman was saying today about the federal government not having good scientific advisors, which is astonishing to me. So what's happening with science? And I know that science is dependent on money, as is everything, it seems, but it's sort of, there's a fundamental belief amongst the population about the sanctity of science, I suppose.
Well, I can't agree with you about Tony Fauci.
No.
I mean, he was giving incredibly reliable, he was just one of the voices for the science. And he went through very rough waters with the Trump regime on that. And I've got only respect for what Tony Fauci did. And I can't find...
I would reinforce that. I've known Tony Fauci for a very long time. He's a tough, absolutely decent guy. Served a number of US presidents on both sides of the House. He's nonpartisan and a very skillful person in that public space. He did his best. I mean, the person who was enormously damaged by Trump was Deborah Birx, who, again, wonderful infectious disease doctor, was a colonel in the United States Army when I first met her. But she was actually thrown to the lions and sat on the stage with that moron as he spouted his absolute nonsense and toxic drivel. I mean Trump, not Fauci. Fauci backed off and went and hid, actually. I don't blame him.
Sorry, Fauci doesn't come across so well in what happened in Wuhan, and his vested interest in China was not disclosed, and he refused to. I know you can't hear that, but just in response.
Peter, Norman, does either of you have anything to say about the other point that the questioner made about the objectivity of scientists more generally?
So there's been a lot said, I don't know what Peter's view is this, but there's been a lot said about the origins of the virus, and News Limited has been pushing that it came from the Institute of Virology, and pushing that hard. And that has become, if you like, a conspiracy theory. Now, if you look at the science of that, so that's been pushed, but in a very unbalanced way. So it is possible it was a release from the Institute of Virology, very good Institute of Virology, very good research. They were doing dangerous, potentially dangerous, what are called gain-of-function studies, trying to find out what was the genetic signature of a pandemic virus. Now, they weren't doing that in secret. They were doing it with American researchers. The genomes of those viruses that they were fiddling with, which could have escaped, were nothing like SARS-CoV-2. And there's been 9 or 10 spillovers for animals in the last 20 years of coronavirus from animals, particularly in China. So if you were betting, you'd have to say this comes from an animal. And the Chinese were onto it. They'd even isolated the northeast corner of the wet market, and the cases spread out from there. It's just the Chinese local public health people were not allowed to do it by the Chinese regime, and they were victimized for it. So if you wanted to take a Trumpist view of the world, Chinese politics caused pandemics. Chinese politics caused this pandemic, but it wasn't a leak from the Institute of Virology.
Two things that China got wrong is, firstly, some of their security people, local security people, locked up some doctors who were simply exchanging information on social media that they were seeing a new and dangerous problem. So these morons actually put them in prison. But then that soon was by the board. And the sequence of the virus that the Chinese found, I mean, it was first described in December. The sequence was published globally in the January. people who knew about this were the virologists. When our Prime Minister raised the issue of the virus origins in a way that was both aggressive and stupid and did nothing for this country, absolutely nothing, except cost us billions of dollars in trade, he might have just stepped back a little bit and actually asked people like Eddie Holmes at the University of Sydney, who's right on top of this, and got the 2021 Prime Minister's Prize. So basically, if you want to know about science, maybe start with scientists. It's a very good place to start. I don't think there's a serious science constituency out there.
Before I
now.
take the next question, can I just clarify something with the person who keeps holding up little signs to me? My understanding was we were going to 1:15. 1:15 is what it was advertised as, so I think I'll take that as correct unless told
So
otherwise.
it was a bit carried off.
Yeah. Over here.
Hi, I'm an epidemiologist, and during the COVID period, I would advise people on Twitter to use Google Scholar to decide which experts they might want to pay attention to. Really simple, really free, publicly available. How come journalists don't do that?
Well, some do. Some do.
Yeah.
But, you know, there are, in order to use Google Scholar to assess somebody's credibility, you also have to understand, you know, the way in which academic journals are ranked, for example. And some journalists do. Liam Mannix, for example, wrote a whole thing about, you know, how he assessed his sources using academic journal rankings, not just the fact that you had something published somewhere and so on. So Google Scholar is helpful, and some journalists do use it, but it's not your complete answer, I don't think. And when you have well-credentialed experts, and as I say, I don't think they were necessarily disagreeing on the science, although on the airborne virus thing, there was disagreement on that at the beginning, certainly. You had Nick Coatsworth saying it wasn't airborne for a long while. Now, you know, an average journalist will say, well, this guy is the Deputy Chief Health Officer. You know, who am I to say that he shouldn't be listened to seriously?
I read a book several years back trying to explain how a layperson who has no interest in science can look at science and how they can evaluate. And Google Scholar was one of the suggestions.
Yeah.
It's called the Knowledge Wars. And it was for people who have no interest in science or don't even like science. But I suspect few journalists have ever looked at it. And it is a difficult area. And scientists will always disagree. And the disagreement will be greatest until things actually become clarified. And that's what we saw. Part of the reason why they focused so much on surfaces with SARS-CoV-2 was because with the first coronavirus, it was being spread by contact. And they were sanitizing elevator buttons and all that sort of stuff. So, you know, science is a dynamic, and we're not priests or popes in science. We're actually trying to put out our best understanding. That's how scientists speak. Our best understanding is that.
The other thing that I would say is, so you're an epidemiologist, and so you know that these are the journals and this is the ranking. As a journalist, I cover so many things in a week. I have to know about economics, I need to know about trade, I need to know about foreign policy. Most journalists these days, because of the fact that there's just not that much money around, cover many, many, many areas. And the latest crisis, you have to start learning what the reliable sources of information are and who the reliable people are. So every time there's a new crisis, there was the financial crisis, we all suddenly had to become economists. And everyone says, why don't the journalists tell us this, or why don't the journalists know that? It's because it's a new topic to many, many journalists. Of course, there are people who specialize in those areas, and those people at the very beginning of reporting on a crisis will most likely have the better reporting because they come at it from an area of expertise. But suddenly everything has become about the pandemic. Trade policy is about the pandemic. Foreign policy is about the pandemic. Everything is tinged by the pandemic. And so someone like me who's never done health reporting, who has never had any real reason to talk to an epidemiologist before suddenly has to wade through this information, and you're talking to people who have only ever done this thing. That is their area of expertise. And you don't always know some of the things that they tell you, whether they are reliable, whether the person you're talking to is reliable, whether they have a particular horse in the game. These are things we're learning as well. And so I would say at the beginning of any crisis, when you read that first kind of chapter of history that journalists are writing, we are also trying to figure it out. We are just human beings, many of us young, some of us younger than others, some of us older than others, some of us have had access and experience in this particular field and some haven't. And so that's something to remember as well. There isn't a conspiracy. It's not that we don't want to report well or we don't want to give you the information. It's just sometimes we still have to figure it out ourselves.
I just want to it's a really important question you've asked, and it's one that exercises us all the time. Who do you get to be experts? And Google Scholar is a minefield because there's a lot of crap journals out there with people getting published. And if you're coming to it cold, it's very hard to distinguish necessarily between good journals and and you can get a good paper and a bad journal as well. So it is complex. And then the other issue here, I mean, so we've got some internationally, giants of virology in Australia. Candice Sabaro at the Doherty Institute is just phenomenal. I mean, a giant in her field. But if you're talking about pandemic control, they're not necessarily well published. So we only had 4 or 5 people in Australia who actually had experience on the ground in pandemic control. They weren't published at all. But they existed, and of course the government knew who they were, but weren't using them as advisors. So you had to exercise some judgment there. It's not all about your published papers.
Yeah. And I've been working on how viruses cause disease and viral immunity for more than 50 years. We're really struggling to understand a lot of how COVID actually works, especially long COVID. I mean, it's complex, it's confusing, it's very hard to interact with it. And no wonder it's confusing for the broader public and for journalists. It's confusing to us. So we try to give our best guesses and tell people, in some cases, this is a best guess.
Yeah. I mean, there's with the benefit of a fair bit of experience on the many occasions when I'm pitched in to report on something which I know nothing about, what you look for is the respected expert, the independent expert, hopefully somebody who's a little bit away from the fray or above the fray. And you ring them up and hope that your reputation is good enough so that they will help you. And you just say, look, I'm not wanting to quote you or report you. Give me a heads up. Who's good, who's bad. I'm hearing this. How should I assess that?
And I'll give you... Sorry.
Those conversations are gold.
I'll give you one example of the sort of thing that went on. You had the Deputy Chief Medical Officer of Australia giving a lecture to journalists how aerosol spread was rubbish and did not happen. And he was using measles as an example of that. And it just so happened the day before, I'd attended a webinar, University of California, San Francisco, which is like, I don't know, Peter will correct me, but probably number 3 in immunology in the world, probably number 4 in virology. It's right up there. And they were demolishing every one of those arguments. So what do? I just tweet out the webinar and say, have a listen to this. So-called experts were not necessarily reliable at a level.
Never occurred to me from day one that this thing wasn't spreading by aerosol. I could never understand the argument. Why was there a discussion out there? It was ridiculous.
Yes, but, I was listening to CoronaCast and listening to both Norman and Peter and watching what you were doing on Twitter and so on. So I was probably a bit with it, but my sympathies are entirely with a young journalist who comes to the field knowing nothing, and here's the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. I mean, you're entitled to assume that's an authoritative source.
The other thing that's problematic is there's a bit of a Tower of Babel out there because different disciplines speak different languages. I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm an immunologist. But, the doctors were thinking that the size of something would spread by, we're actually saying aerosol. I think it was a 5 micrometer droplet. Whereas actually the engineers talk about aerosol as a 100 micrometer droplet. So, there's a little bit of confusion.
Hi, thank you for the very interesting conversation. So my question is really for all of you. Full disclosure, I work at the ABC in a role that involves distributing ABC content on social media. And one thing that has really frustrated me and worries me is seeing, in general, audiences not being able to discern what is a reliable source, which is sort of, you guys have touched on during this conversation. And it seems to me to be a real threat to democracy and science. And I'm wondering what thoughts you have about how we educate people to be literate in terms of discerning, and what is accurate, who is reliable, because I can do it reflexively, but it's a learned skill and it takes some time to acquire. Do we teach children from when they're in prep and learning how to read? Is it required? Do you need to get some sort of license to be on social media? I feel like it's a very urgent question, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Margaret,
Hello.
let's start with you.
Okay. Well, license to be on social media, that's not going to work because, freedom of speech, okay, for all its good and evils. Social media is, the new town square, and we hear all sorts of good and ill things there. But I think the question is really important. As I said earlier, misinformation is one of the great evils of our time. In wearing another hat, I've done some reporting on QAnon and have been just sort of staggered by how many intelligent and thoughtful people have been sucked into that bizarre conspiracy theory. It's really terrifying. So yes, I do think, and I know that whenever we come across a social problem, people tend to say, the school should do something about it, just as they say, the media should do something about it. But I do think that this is such a threat to everything, certainly to democracy, but to all sorts of other things as well, that we need to be developing curriculum for school students right through the curriculum on how to assess information. And it's a difficult thing to do. I mean, I'm not a teacher. Well, I am a teacher, but of adults. I'm not a teacher of children. It's a difficult thing to do because, of course, Galileo was misinformation once, right? And he turned out to be right. So you have to do it while also maintaining an attitude of, openness and curiosity. But I think it's a challenge we have to get to grips with. And it's not only about media literacy. People tend to talk about teaching media literacy, and that's part of it. But it's actually probably not the most of it. It's just a bit of it.
Yep.
Zoya, do you want to have a go at this one?
We really need to embed in people's consciousness from kids is the idea of probability and relative risk. Everything that a scientist says or does, it's in our mindset. But a lot of scientists find it very hard to engage with the fact that that's not the way people normally think. I mean, they think of they relate to anecdote and emotionally charged messaging a lot of the time. The other problem was that I kept encountering, particularly on Twitter, is people would send me stuff saying, why aren't you listening to Dr. X? And there's this American guy who's got a white coat and he's got an MD, an impressive credential, who's spouting total crap. And, you're supposed to debate with these guys. You can't debate with them because that gives them legitimacy. And they eat your life. And you can't have that happen.
It's certainly something that I struggle with, and even just so I know a lot of Russian people, I struggle with some of their inability to discern real facts from propaganda, and that is something that is very, very difficult. I mean, look, we've had this problem for a very long time, the difficulty of knowing how you imbue people with the ability to discern good information from bad information. I think the social media platforms are struggling with this question, and it's one of the things that the algorithms are doing, and the problem with the algorithms are vast, and one of the issues is that if something gets amplified, it then gets re-amplified, and you start pushing yourself further and further into a particular type of information and media, and you just go down a rabbit hole, and a lot of people go down these rabbit holes. No one starts out thinking that a pizza parlor is home to Hillary Clinton's pedophile ring. You start and you move in that direction. how you resolve that. Obviously, the children are part of it, but I've heard I've heard conversations between people where the children get this education at school, but then back home, their parents are saying, oh, well, climate change isn't real. Your teachers are just telling you this because this is part of this grand conspiracy. So don't say anything in the classroom because you'll get in trouble. But just so you know, it's not real. And then those kids start to doubt the things their teachers tell them, and then they doubt their children in general, their teachers in general. So it's a really significant problem. I think we probably have focused a lot on young people, but we actually also need to focus a lot on the older generations. And for my parents' generation, for instance, things that are published are imbued with a certain sense of authority because they are published, and they don't necessarily make the distinction between new media like Politico, which is a legitimate media source. We have fact checkers, we have sub-editors, we have a sort of commitment to truth and non-bias, and other actors who don't have, it's just people who are saying whatever it is that it takes to get whatever it is they want to get out there. So I think there is a degree of education that needs to be aimed towards a broader audience, so people who are older as well as the younger generation. And I think that's a question for people like you, talking to people and spreading the word of like, this is reliable, this is not reliable. But honestly, I don't think we're going to solve it, because a lot of people have been trying to solve it for quite some time, and no one really has come up with anything that has solved it yet.
Well, federal seats in Melbourne, the elderly Liberal voters in Melbourne have had a shock that science has prevailed and their party's been thrown out of power.
Well, this seems an appropriate place to wrap up.
Is that too controversial for you, Deborah?
Just a matter of timing, Norman. This does seem an appropriate place to mention again that this session is sponsored by +61J Media. If you care about independent media and if you care about a Jewish context and you're not already receiving our twice weekly bulletins, which are free because it's public interest journalism, then please go on and subscribe, and you will get discussion of these issues in responsible journalism twice a week. That's my plug. Thank you very much to our panellists, Zoya Sheftalovich, Norman Swan, Margaret Simons and Peter Doherty. As I thought, they were an exceptional panel, and I'm sure you'll join me in thanking them.